In our ongoing conversations with the regulators, we're going to continue to talk about the consolidation of the regulators and what that means for the industry, what that means for you, and the challenges that they're going to have in the future. And today we're going to talk with Andrew Kriegler from CIRO. Hi, I'm Chris Reynolds, and I'm on a mission to help independent financial advisors build a better business through a remarkable client experience. In this podcast, you're going to learn how to do that from my conversations with the visionaries, the leaders, the independent advisors who are reshaping the future of the financial advice industry. At the end of each episode, you're going to walk away with an actionable idea that you can take and use right now, and it will help you to build a better business today. This is Turning the Page. As we've talked about in past podcasts, regulation is part of any business. It keeps consumers safe, keeps all the players in line, and makes sure that we're all following the same rules. And in my mind, there's really two ways you can look at regulation. You can understand them, embrace them, and build processes in your business to adhere to them and make it easy. Or you can complain around the lines of regulators don't understand my business. Those are the two tracks you can get. Personally, I go for the first one. Let's really understand where the regulators are coming from. Let's look what they're looking for and how we can run our businesses to make sure we stay on the right side of that. And to help us with that, I think we're going to go right to the top today. Today, we have a great guest. We have Andrew Kriegler. He was actually speaking at one of our conferences in September. And as I saw him speak, and they were doing sort of a fireside chat, I was like, this would be a really interesting podcast because a lot of our listeners ask me the same questions over and over about regulation and where they're coming from. And I'm like, this is great. Let's go right to the top. So for those who don't know who Andrew is, he is the CEO of now CIRO, the Canadian Investment Regulatory Organization. And that just started. It was just January 2023. And that was from an amalgamation of our SROs. Both IIROC and MFDA came together, and we'll get a little bit more on that. He used to be the president and CEO of IIROC before this particular role. And before that, he was with OSFI, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, which also a very, very big role. But what I didn't know, he's also spent 25 years in the private sector. He was on our side of the business, both with CIBC and with Moody's. So a lot of experience on both sides. But now, as I said, leads this other organization that runs the regulation and the wealth management business. So welcome, Andrew. It's a pleasure to have you show, and I'm very excited on what we're going to talk about.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
So let's start with how I always start. Andrew, why don't you tell us your story? How did you actually get here? Like, what was your impetus to get into the wealth management business? You certainly saw it from both sides of the street. And how did you get here to the position you're in?
Well, I guess my path is probably as meandering as anyone else's. It's hard to say that it was planned. It just kind of worked out this way. But maybe the thing I'd like to start with is just to give you a sense for how much this business that we all work in attracted me when I first had an exposure to it. I was an undergraduate here at the University of Toronto, and I already had a job. I had been hired by Arthur Andersen, and I hadn't started yet. I was still in the last term of the year, and I happened to be in the room where all the career brochures were.
Oh, okay.
And I was waiting for somebody, so I pulled this thing off the wall, out of the shelf off the wall, and it was a brochure for one of the bulge bracket firms in New York. I'd never really thought about the business, didn't really understand it for that matter. And I spent a few minutes reading what was, still a glossy kind of sales brochure for why people should come to work in investment banking. And I was kind of hooked. So went off to Arthur Andersen, which was a great firm. I was on the consulting side, what's now Accenture.
Right.
And through a chance meeting a few months later with a colleague, a friend of mine from school, I managed to talk my way into a job interview at Goldman Sachs in New York.
Wow.
And through a certain degree of luck and a little bit of chutzpah, I got myself a job, and I've been in and around the business ever since. And it's now been 35 years.
Wow. And I guess you love it, or you wouldn't be in it.
Well, the thing I love about it is that it's intellectually challenging. There's something different every day to deal with. And it brings together a whole bunch of aspects of knowledge and experience that I think fit very well together. I like finance. I studied a little bit of it in school,
Right.
I like the precision of it, the math, if you will, that you bring to this. I like the fact that we are dealing with people, and it's human behavior that we're trying to recognize and encourage, and in some cases discipline if necessary,
And discourage,
discourage, and so it's markets, which I like. It's finance, it's human behavior, and it all kinds of comes together in the world that I operate in today.
No, I like it, and it's. I think it's very important. What regulation does, because this industry, and I tell everyone, we're really in the trust business. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're in. The wealth management business is about trust. People come to us because they trust that our advice is going to be good, that we have their best interest in mind, that we're going to guide them in the right direction. And again, the regulator's job is to make sure that we don't break that trust, is that we do what we say we're going to do and disclose, whatever we need to disclose to make sure that people can make the right decisions. So let's start, for my audience, let's start with the very basics. What's the purpose of an SRO in Canada, and how did we get to this point of where we are today?
So SROs, there are some in other parts of the world, but they're primarily here in North America.
Okay.
So in Canada, we have CIRO now. Of course, we had the MFDA and IIROC before, and we go all the way back to the bond traders subcommittee of the Toronto Chamber of Commerce in 1916.
Wow.
And if you go back in the United States, where there's really two big SROs, one's called FINRA, which is pretty much what we do, obviously in a much bigger market, and their counterpart called the National Futures Association, which deals with the futures markets instead of securities. They have a similar past. In FINRA's case, it goes back to the National Association of Securities Dealers in the early part of the last century. So there's a long history of the industry kind of coming together and saying, we need to have some rules of behavior. We need to have some standards we all need to follow. So it's a level playing field. So it's not a race to the bottom. So our collective credibility can be maintained. And then, if you march forward in history, both in Canada and the United States, after the Great Depression and the crash and all of that sort of stuff that happened in the late 20s and 30s, you saw governments begin to have the responsibility to put in place more formal legislative-based systems. But what they did in both countries is to build around what was there.
Right.
And so here in Canada, we evolved to being the Investment Dealers Association. Then the Mutual Fund Dealers Association was created. We brought in market regulation when multiple markets on the equity side were created. And eventually we are here today, CIRO, where we're recognized doing a job on behalf of the system by all 10 provinces and 3 territories. And we also have quite considerable links with agencies of the federal government as well.
Right. So it's sort of one place that, all the rules are adhered to, all the members can, have a say into it, and, make sure that everyone, as I said, there's a level playing field, that everyone knows what the rules are and sort of runs by them. And that's what creates, good trust for the consumer, going back to my original premise. So
Absolutely.
Now MFDA, IIROC, they're coming together under CIRO, under your leadership. In my opinion, very good for the industry. And so maybe talk about some of the main benefits right out of the gate for advisors, for dealers, for consumers. I think there's a lot, but you probably even know more.
Let's actually take it the other way for a second and stand on the other side of the doorway that we just walked through to create this merged, this amalgamated entity. If you go back 25 years or so to the time when the MFDA was created, we were in a very different market environment. The mutual fund business was not particularly regulated, and there was a consensus amongst really everybody that had to be done. But the mutual fund business also lived in a different world than did what was then the traditional brokerage business. And the other piece that was off on the side was market regulation, because bond markets weren't heavily regulated. The equity markets, each of the exchanges, and there were lots at that point, were their own SROs. And technically, they still are, but they've given us some of that responsibility. And so it was a very siloed, kind of broken up patchwork quilt. which, in Canada, that's part of our challenge. Our system, our constitution gives securities regulation to the provinces, not to the federal government.
Right.
And one of the things that's really important about having an SRO that goes from coast to coast is that we bring consistency as a layer between the 10 provincial and 3 territorial securities authorities and a market which tries to operate for everybody.
Right across the board.
So what did we get by walking through this door together? Well, the biggest thing was we started to knock down some of the arbitrary walls between different parts of the business.
Right.
So if you go back to the day before the merger closed, you could not, or one could not, domicile a mutual fund distribution business, mutual fund dealer, and people who are only licensed to distribute mutual funds in the same legal entity, the same business as a broker dealer.
Right.
Which is, I think, by any objective measure, a little silly.
Well, as certainly one who operates said, it was quite difficult. You pray to different gods. Well,
that's true. And you know what? It wasn't so bizarre 25 years ago because the businesses didn't overlap.
Right.
And what's happened in the last the last 2 decades in all parts of our society, frankly, is we've seen a breaking down of what were historically siloed elements, be it businesses, be it various social interactions, and it's much more of a continuous spectrum.
Right.
So people would like to be able, we did some research on this a few years ago, people would like to be able to one-stop shop their financial services to the greatest degree possible.
Absolutely, once they establish that trust.
So, we talked about what you asked about what's good about this from a perspective of investors or dealers or the country as a whole. I can use the same example to illustrate, I think, all three. So if you were a client of a integrated financial institution, let's use a bank as an example, but
Sure.
It could be, there are others. And the people who are in the bank branch are licensed to distribute mutual funds, as many of them are. And you walk in there and you've got your checking account and your mortgage perhaps, and you have some savings that you put into the mutual fund. But that was early in your life as an individual or as a family. And now you've gotten a little further along and you have some more savings and your life has gotten a little more complicated. And so maybe you need to incorporate a broader range of investment options than you did before.
Right.
So in addition to the challenge of the company that's, like your institution, who are trying to deal with both sides of this and have to have separate legal entities, think about the poor client. They're on this side of the branch, and they're dealing with somebody. And now because their life has gotten a little more complicated, they want to stay with the same institution. They walk 25 feet to the other end of the branch. They have to literally tear up their entire historical existence.
Right.
They've got to get onboarded again. They got to fill out 80 billion pages of paperwork again. The performance history is gone. The reporting is gone. They've got a new person to deal with. Everything gets turned upside down.
Right.
And for no particular reason. So we talked about the firms, we've talked about the clients. Let's talk about the advisors. There's no smooth career path. There's no development path. And when you're part of a single institution, I think firms want to be able to bring in people, develop them, broaden them along their careers, take them on a track, both from a professional education and a size of business perspective. And all that is made very much more difficult if you have to rip people out of one legal entity and drop into another, especially if there's different licensing requirements, oversight requirements, et cetera, et cetera. The biggest part
back offices, new paperwork, all of the things that you mentioned. And I think that's a very, very good illustration of why this is so beneficial to both consumers and the advisors.
So that's what we're working on. And it's funny, there were a lot of rules that were very, very similar on both sides of the predecessor SROs. So we don't have to change that many of the words. Some have to change, but not that many. The bigger challenge is, over time, 2 different organizations, 2 different sets of interpretations evolved.
Right.
And in some ways, getting people to change how they think is a much bigger task than just changing the words on the page. But even there, we're making a lot of progress together.
Well, that was going to be my next question is, I love the direction, I love the future and everything, but what do you think are going to be the big challenges, both, I guess, from your side and from the organizational side, which we sit on?
Sure. So I think there's a couple things to probably talk about. First thing is to say there are really two mergers or two amalgamations going on at the same time. And the outside facing one, which I think you as a business leader, the firms worry about more, is how are we going to put the rule books together? How are we going to consolidate how we do exams so that they're done consistently and are better organized? How are we going to upgrade our technology so that we can take in data and information from you once, right, and not repeatedly? All of those sorts of regulatory kind of things. Mm-hmm. But we're also two organizations that are coming together at the same time. And so there's an inside the house kind of merger amalgamation that's happening simultaneously. And that means that, for example, the two finance systems we had have to become one. Right. The two HR systems have to become one. All the other IT and technology has to be sorted. We actually are now 3 days away from moving into a new office together.
As we chatted a little bit about, now that's step one, get everyone in one place.
Absolutely. So, and then really underlying all of that sort of mechanical stuff, we have to become one culture.
Right. That is and I would probably agree with you. That's always the biggest challenge. And as someone who's, done many acquisitions and put companies together, that's always where, the time is spent, is on the culture and the thinking and even the language coming together to sound the same and have that sort of universal message out to everyone you speak with. I certainly can see that.
Oh, it's going well. It's going well.
Yeah, no, as I said, I think it's positive for everyone. I don't think that there's really any negatives that I can come up with, and it's just a matter of prioritization and moving forward. I've been having a lot of conversations on this particular topic, and if you'd like to have a conversation about regulation and what it means for your business, happy to have a coffee with you. We can have a conversation about the new regulations. We can talk about how you put the processes in place to make sure that you adhere to them, and also what are the benefits and what does it mean to your business to go forward. So if you'd like to have a virtual coffee with Chris, just go to the show notes, hit on the link. Happy to have a chat. And one of the questions I do get, and this might be a little bit different from just the talking about the merger, the merger, is they always say, how do regulators come up with their rules and policies, and how can I give my feedback? And I already know sort of somewhat the answer, but I'd like to hear it from you. Like, sure. sort of, how do these policies get risen, and how do you get feedback, and how do they get sort of changed or modernized, I guess is another way to put it. Right.
So I think there's a couple of different pieces to that answer. Let me talk about how we make rules today, how we do guidance today, because that's an area in which the industry is really, really important, along with other stakeholders that matter, of course. But we are a self-regulatory organization.
Exactly.
And I think that that's important to underline that. So we have, it would take me a couple of minutes on my fingers and toes to count them all, but a series of advisory and professional committees that we rely on to a considerable extent to get input, not just on rules once they're out there for public comment, but much earlier in the process in terms of, this is the issue we're trying to deal with. Right. How should we deal with it? What are the practical realities that exist in the business? The businesses that we regulate that would make it easier or harder or impractical to pursue some sort of regulatory outcome. And that's true in the retail wealth management business that you're most focused on, but it's also true in the corporate investment banking business.
Right.
It is true in the bond markets. It's true in the equity markets that we regulate, and so on and so on. And some of these areas are incredibly technical. So let me give you just one example.
Sure.
We do real-time market surveillance for the Canadian system on behalf of our colleagues at the Securities Commissions, and we also work very closely with the Bank of Canada. We take in upwards of 3 billion transactions a day.
Wow.
And in the equity markets, there are some very, very complicated market structure rules about how orders are put together, how they have to be looked at. There's best execution requirements and so on. if we were sitting in a vacuum trying to make rules around that stuff, that would not be terribly efficient. You need to have people around the table who do this every day, who understand that the objective is to operate in the public interest and to have a market that's got credibility and integrity, and who want to contribute to that process. So we have a market rules advisory committee full of technical experts that has an enormous amount of input in what we do. We also have an investor advisory panel, right. People who are looking at things from an investor perspective, so that they too have a voice, an explicit voice in how we put rules together. Finally, one of the things that both the predecessor SROs had, and using slightly different names at the time, were councils or regional councils that spread across the country to get input from different perspectives, and primarily from people who faced, within a couple of levels, the public.
Right.
So at the former investment dealer SRO, which I was associated with, we called them district councils. The mutual fund side called them regional councils, which is what we've ended up keeping as a name. And I used to go across the country once or twice a year and sit down with these people. And the reason was that when you got outside of Toronto, and perhaps to a lesser degree Montreal, you didn't have head office compliance, corporate legal folks. It's very good to have them.
Yeah,
but it was
yeah.
people who were branch managers,
right,
or regional managers, and sometimes they were player coaches. So they actually did some advisory work themselves. Well, who better to talk to about the practical realities of living with not just the public interest of the regulation, but how it actually works on the ground, than the folks who do it every day.
Yeah,
and so. All that to say is there's an enormous amount of opportunity for the people who are going to be listening to this podcast to get involved if they're interested. People who care about the system being good for Canadians should get involved.
I agree. And I'm glad that we are doing this, because I don't know if that is as widely known, and I know of it. And as I said, I knew sort of the answer beforehand, but as I said, I still get this question constantly in my role. So I think that this hopefully spreads that message even more so, because at the end of the day, as I started with, the SRO is there to protect consumers. They're to make sure that, all the players know what the rules are, but at the end of the day, we are in the trust business, and we want to make sure that that trust is maintained in the industry that we all love and grow in. And I think everyone's on board with that. I've never met an advisor that says, no, we don't want to protect the consumer. I've never even heard of that. But you've probably seen things from your perspective that they don't necessarily get to see on a regular basis. And I thought maybe you could share just some of the things that, you've seen in your probably elaborate career, of things, and this is why the regulation is done in this type of way, and I think that would be good for the people that are listening.
Sure. Well, there's a few things in terms of examples that I can give you. If people really want to get a sense for it, get onto our website and go take a look at the enforcement proceedings.
Actually, that is a good idea. I should actually get a link and send it over to everybody.
You should, because some of those are, I think, quite illustrative. I think there's two purposes to the rules, and one of them, which I think is everyone will understand, and you've already touched on, is the idea of a level playing field. And the level playing field goes in both directions, in the sense that there are some behaviors or some practices around which you don't want competitive behavior to exhibit itself. You don't want to have a race to the bottom in terms of standards. You also want consistency across the country, so that if someone walks into a firm in Nova Scotia, they're going to have the same level of disclosure, the same level of protection as someone who walks into a firm in Alberta, because we're one country and we all deserve the same standards. The other thing I would say, or the other level of this, is just, I guess, in response to the reality that we're all human beings. And in my experience, 99% of the people in this business, just like 99% of the people who are in the legal business or the healthcare business or any other sector of society, are good, decent people who want to do the right thing.
Right.
You'll notice I didn't say 100%.
Right. It's never 100%, unfortunately.
It's never 100. And so one of the reasons that the rules are there, in addition to consistency and standardization and equal protection, is One, to try and protect against mistakes because you
Yep.
put in place procedures. They're not perfect, but that's what you're trying to cover off. And then you're trying to protect against the bad actors because there are some.
Yes.
And some are just bad because they're bad and they steal from their clients. And some are wind up bad because they get into trouble and gee, I'll just borrow the money for a little while. I'm sure I'll pay it back.
Right.
It doesn't often work out that way. So, those things happen, and we have to have a system just like we do with the legal system more generally.
Yep.
That says there are certain rules of the road and there's certain things you don't do.
Right.
And there's consequences if you break those rules.
Right. And if you have, what we've said all the way along, if you have the right processes, right procedures in place, if you're dealing with clients fairly and no one ever has a problem. If you're following, the way that things are outlined and as I said, adhering to the processes, these never become an issue. It's only when you go off those marks or, that's where we start to see some of those issues.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that's on people's mind right now is, of course, with the client-focused reforms and some of the new rules put into place. And so maybe you can comment just a little bit on, the role of technology in that, and also, from your perspective, what we're hoping. I think we all know what we're hoping to accomplish, but why now and where it's going to go.
Well, the where it's going to go part, I'm not necessarily a whole lot better at telling the future than you are. But why now? I think a couple of things have happened. There's been an evolution in how complex our business is, both in terms of the complexity of needs of Canadians that are being served by the people in this industry and the other adjacent financial services providers. But also a huge jump in the complexity of the products and services that have been designed to meet them.
Right.
And so it's harder than it was to be able to say to a client or to demonstrate to a regulator that, I've done the right thing in servicing, this client's needs.
Right.
And so the client-focused reforms were simply designed to try and lay out at a broad level, like, this is the standard of practice that we should all adhere to.
All right.
Now, it gets hard because the world is so complicated. And I think that ties back to the technology question that you were just raising. I think technology can go a long way towards supporting what would otherwise be a very painful and painstaking exercise to demonstrate that you've done the things that are required in order to meet those standard practices. And certainly here at CIRO, we're using technology the same way ourselves.
Right.
So, we have as an example, a suitability engine. So when we do exams of a firm or a branch, and we intake client portfolios and client characteristics, we don't have someone with the green eye shade and the armband anymore with a ledger.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
Just the same way we couldn't possibly monitor 3 billion transactions a day on the equity and debt markets if we didn't have machine learning and artificial intelligence and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So I think, there's always pluses and minuses to this stuff, but I think the good thing is, with technology, we together can do a better job for Canadians, and we can evidence that better job has been done. And I think that helps everyone all the way around.
Right. And by the way, I completely agree. This is a very complex industry, and especially on what I call my side, the independent side. Our advisors literally have 35,000 different options to satisfy various clients' needs. And I think all of us would like to know, how did you come to that conclusion? How did this solution be appropriate for this client? I don't think it's about this enormous amount of work. It's simply about showing your work and making sure that you can prove that on a regular basis, both to the consumer and hopefully the regulator at the same time.
Right, exactly.
So Andrew, one question that's on all advisors' minds right now, and I know it's a pretty hot topic, is the ability of advisors to actually incorporate and have their commissions guided towards that. I know you guys just did a paper on it, so maybe you can comment on that because it's very timely.
Sure. The question of commission redirection which is the term that we use sort of inside the regulatory side of the house, has been a big one for a long time. Advisors who worked for mutual fund dealers were able to do it for a very long time. Advisors who worked for investment dealers weren't, for a variety of historical reasons. And one of the things we committed to as part of this amalgamation actually was delivering an answer on this.
Right.
And so, yes, you're right. We put out a paper on it, a consultation paper. I guess technically we called it a white paper within the last few weeks. And I'd encourage everyone to read it. It's not that hard to read and it's not that long. But I think what it does is sort of sets out the reality of the system we work in.
Right.
So we had sort of, I'm going to call it 2 or 3 broad options. And I'm not going to repeat the whole paper, but I want to hit the boundary conditions, because the easiest thing to do would have been simply to duplicate in investment dealers what had been allowed in mutual fund dealers.
Right.
Okay, we could have done that. That would have left us with a couple of holes, because even in the mutual fund dealer world, you could not do redirection in Alberta. It was specifically prohibited.
Right. Yeah, that's
and
true.
There were significant uncertainties in a couple of other provinces. The other option, which is the absolute other end of the spectrum, would be to wave a magic wand and change the law. So, there are many people, especially on the mutual fund side, who are also cross-licensed in insurance.
Right.
The Insurance Act in the provinces of Canada basically all say that the insurance business can be carried out by a not natural person, a corporation.
A corporation.
It's not the case in the Securities Act.
Mm-hmm.
Securities Act says you have to do it. You, the registered person. And so, having had some success in changing laws in Canada, I can tell you that's a very long process, and we can't get there.
Yeah.
So what we put in the middle as a preferred solution from our perspective is this idea of an incorporated salesperson, where they have a personal corporation. They're prepared. There's some limits on what that thing can do.
Right.
There's some limited regulatory oversight over it. There's some limits on who can own it. Family members and so on would generally be the case. And what it does is it tries to bring the personal corporations inside the regulatory perimeter to the least extent necessary. Like, we're not trying to overdo this, but in order to make sure the system has a bit of integrity and it holds together. So that's out there for discussion. It took us a little while longer, frankly, than I had hoped to put the paper out, but it's a paper that incorporates not only our views, but importantly, the views of our colleagues across the country in the securities commissions, because this is a joint effort.
Right. Everyone's going to agree.
And we're looking forward to seeing how we go from here. I mean, this is one big thing, but there's a lot more to be done over the next couple of years.
Oh, I can imagine. You got your job set out for you. That's for sure. You're never going to get bored over there.
I think that's right.
So now this has been great. So now I do what's called the rapid fire. I got 3 questions for you, and just whatever pops in your mind, that's what you answer me. So the first question is, what are you passionate about? I'm most passionate about my family. That always comes first. The second question is, what has been your most memorable, I usually say most memorable client interaction, but most memorable interaction, let's say, from, let's say the consumer side of your business? From the consumer side, okay. Because I was always on the institutional side. Right. I never, so you never really touched too much retail. I never did retail business. But you know what? I'll trade you a different memory, because it's one that that has stuck with me since the beginning. I walked onto the fixed income trading floor as part of my job interview in 1987 at 85 Broad Street in New York. And this was a day before big flat screen monitors and all the rest of it. So every trader and salesperson in front of them had these little 9x9 Quotron screens that were stacked up in blocks of 12. So 3 or 16, 3 or 4 of them stacked 3 or 4 high. And as a result, the trading desks were like canyons that you had to walk down. And I walked onto the trading floor. I saw all this, saw the activity,
the excitement, and with the thought that came to my mind, I know it sounds a little silly, was, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore.
This is a new world.
Yeah.
I love it. And my last question to you is, especially in this role, how do you want to be remembered?
I would like to be remembered for having made the system a little better.
I think that's all that we can hope for, all of us. So in my little rant, in summary, this has been great, Andrew. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I think this is going to be very helpful for all of our listeners. They're always interested. This is one of the most popular topics that we get. And I think it always comes back to what I started with. It comes back to trust. That's what we're in the business of providing to our clients. They have to trust us. They have to trust the system. They have to trust the oversight. They have to trust the processes. And, the SRO now, they're just doing their job to make sure that those are adhered to and that there's a level playing field for everybody who's playing on that field. So thank you again for being on the show. Any final words for our audience?
I would echo what I said earlier. We are an SRO. In order to be successful, we need the involvement of not just the institutions, the firms that are in this industry, but the people. So please, we welcome your input. We'll welcome your participation, and together we'll make it a better system.
That I couldn't have ended it any better. Andrew, thank you very much for being on the show. As always, I offer up the Coffee with Chris. If you want to talk about your own firm and you want to talk about where you're going and how to use processes in your particular business, happy to do so. And you can find a link in the show notes. Just click on that, and that's how we can set up a time for us to have a coffee. Andrew Kriegler, CIRO, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for joining me on Turning the Page. What did you learn from today's episode? If you follow me on LinkedIn, please drop me a comment there. I'd love to chat with you about it over virtual coffee. Send me a message on LinkedIn, or you can do so at our website. The link's in the show notes. I'm Chris Reynolds, and until next time.